Ethereum is not just another crypto project. It is a massive global ecosystem with thousands of developers, billions in capital, and a reputation that can move with every serious leadership decision. That is why Hsiao-Wei Wang stepping down as co-executive director of the Ethereum Foundation is not just a routine personal update. It lands at a moment when people are already asking bigger questions. Who is actually steering Ethereum? How much central influence does the foundation still have? And what happens when the faces at the top change? Because in crypto, leadership is never just about titles. It affects developer confidence. It affects how builders think about long-term support. It affects how the community reads the direction of the chain. And yes, it affects market perception too. A leadership change can look like a quiet administrative shift on paper, while in reality it can trigger a major debate about governance, strategy, and whether the project is becoming more resilient or more uncertain. That is exactly the question now. Is this a warning sign of instability inside Ethereum's core, or is it the beginning of a new era, where governance becomes more mature, more distributed, and better suited to a network this large? And the answer matters far beyond one person leaving a role. Because if Ethereum is entering a new phase, the ripple effects could shape everything from protocol development to investor confidence. But the real story is not the resignation itself. It is what the community thinks comes next. According to CoinDesk, the immediate catalyst here is simple. Ethereum Foundation co-executive director Hsiao-Wei Wang has announced that she will step down. That is the core event driving the conversation. Not a token launch, not a hard fork, not a price move, just a major leadership change at the center of Ethereum's non-profit backbone. And that matters because the Ethereum Foundation is not a side character. It helps shape the network's long-term direction, coordinates research, supports ecosystem development, and influences how the world reads Ethereum's priorities. So when a co-executive director steps down, people naturally start asking bigger questions. CoinDesk says this announcement has once again pushed the Ethereum community into debate about the future of the foundation itself. That wording is important. This is not being framed as one person quietly leaving and everyone moving on. It is being framed as part of a wider discussion about governance, leadership structure, and whether the foundation is set up for the next phase of Ethereum's growth. In other words, one's departure is a trigger, not the whole story. The real issue underneath is whether Ethereum's leadership model still fits a network that is now bigger, more global, and more institutionally important than ever before. And that is where the conversation gets interesting, because once a leadership change opens the door, people begin rethinking everything from decision-making speed to accountability. And that is exactly why this announcement has so much weight. But the deeper question is not just who is leaving. It is what this says about where Ethereum is headed next. People hear decentralized and assume leadership doesn't matter. That's wrong. In a network like Ethereum, power is spread out, but influence is not the same as powerlessness. The Ethereum Foundation may not control the chain the way a CEO controls a company, but it still matters a lot for coordination, roadmap signaling, grant allocation, research priorities, and keeping top builders engaged. That's why leadership changes can move sentiment far beyond the people directly involved. Investors watch them like a proxy for strategic clarity. Developers do the same because talent follows momentum. If a foundation looks aligned, well-funded, and decisive, builders are more likely to commit years of work. If it looks fragmented or uncertain, the best people may quietly look elsewhere. This is a pattern you see across the tech and finance world. In traditional markets, leadership transitions at major firms can trigger questions about execution, capital allocation, and culture. In crypto, those questions are even louder because the ecosystem is still young, competitive, and highly narrative-driven. One unclear transition can become a signal that the next phase of growth is being negotiated behind the scenes. And that is exactly why Wang's departure has sparked so much debate. It is not just about one person leaving. It has reignited a bigger question. Where is the foundation trying to take Ethereum? And who is actually steering that direction? That question matters because in decentralized ecosystems, leadership is not about control. It is about credibility, coordination, and whether the next wave of builders believes the mission is still clear. The talent exodus is not just a staffing story. It has triggered a fresh debate over leadership, and that matters because in crypto, perception of leadership can move an ecosystem almost as much as code does. The real question is the Ethereum Foundation still important? Of course it is. The question is, who sets the priorities when the network has to choose between scaling, research, developer support, client diversity, and long-term decentralization? That is where leadership becomes practical, not philosophical. And this is why the debate keeps coming back. Every time key people leave, the community revisits the same questions. Who is guiding the roadmap? How are decisions being made? Is the foundation steering the ship or simply supporting the builders already on deck? Those are not small questions. They shape confidence among developers, investors, and institutions watching Ethereum as a long-term platform. Just as important is communication. A foundation can be technically strong and still lose trust if its role feels unclear. The broader ecosystem wants to know whether the foundation is a coordinator, a guardian, or a quiet backstop. If that message is blurry, people start filling in the gaps themselves, so the debate itself is the signal. It shows that leadership perception remains central to Ethereum's identity. And that leads to the bigger issue. If the ecosystem is asking these questions now, what kind of future leadership model does Ethereum actually need? A talent exodus is never just about names leaving a roster. It is a signal, and markets are always listening for signals. When leadership level people move on, the first concern is continuity. Who is carrying the long-term context? Who remembers why a decision was made 3 years ago and which trade-offs were already tested and rejected? That kind of institutional memory matters more than most people admit, because it is what keeps a complex system from constantly relearning the same lessons the hard way. The second issue is execution. A team can have a brilliant roadmap on paper, but if the people who know how to translate strategy into action are gone, progress slows, priorities blur, and coordination gets harder. And once that starts, outsiders begin asking a very uncomfortable question. Is this a temporary shuffle, or the beginning of a transition phase? That is exactly why Ethereum's leadership changes matter so much. On one hand, a talent exodus could be read as a warning sign, especially if it suggests friction, fatigue, or uncertainty at the top. On the other hand, it could also be a natural evolution. Mature networks often move from founder-driven coordination toward broader governance, deeper scalation, and more distributed decision-making. So the real question is not whether change is happening, it is what kind of change this is. Is Ethereum losing key people at the wrong moment or shedding a centralized style in order to become more resilient? And that distinction leads straight into the next issue, whether the new structure can actually deliver. A leadership change can feel like a warning sign, but markets do not only punish uncertainty, they also reward clarity. And that is the real possibility here. For Ethereum, this moment may force something the ecosystem has postponed for too long, a cleaner answer to a simple question. Who is steering, what matters most, and how do all the moving parts fit together? When that answer is vague, the community fills in the blanks with speculation. When it is sharp, confidence tends to follow. That is why some people are looking at this as a possible reset, not a collapse. Not because a single person changes everything, but because leadership changes can create room for a fresh message, tighter priorities, and better alignment between developers, researchers, foundations, and the broader community. In a project as decentralized as Ethereum, that kind of alignment can matter as much as any technical upgrade. And here's the key point. A new era does not mean instant transformation. It means Ethereum may now be under more pressure to define itself clearly, speak more consistently, and show the market what kind of network it wants to be in the next phase. That can be healthy. Sometimes an organization only finds focus after it is forced to explain itself again from scratch. But the bigger question is whether that renewed focus can actually translate into trust, momentum, and a stronger story for the future. And that is where the next layer gets interesting. This story is bigger than one resignation, and that is the entire point. If this were just one person stepping away, the market would shrug and move on. But the significance comes from what the resignation reopened, a wider debate about the Ethereum Foundation, how it is led, and what kind of long-term signal that sends to everyone watching from the outside. And that matters, because in major crypto ecosystems, leadership is never just internal politics. It shapes perception. It affects how developers, investors, institutions, and even casual observers judge whether a network looks stable, credible, and capable of steering itself through change. In other words, people are not only asking who left, they are asking what does this say about the direction of the entire ecosystem. That is why the conversation expands so quickly. A leadership transition can be read as healthy renewal, or it can be read as uncertainty, depending on how it is handled. The same event can look like progress to one audience and instability to another. And in crypto, where trust is already fragile and narratives move fast, that difference is huge. So the real story is not the resignation itself. It is the fact that it triggered a broader discussion about governance, continuity, and confidence at the foundation level. And once a project reaches that stage, the questions become much larger than one person's role. They become questions about where the ecosystem is headed next. The biggest mistake right now is treating Wang's step down as the end of the story. It might be the first clue. So what should you watch next? First, does the Ethereum Foundation actually clarify how leadership works from here? Because if one person leaving is framed as routine, that's one thing. If the organization starts spelling out who makes decisions, who owns priorities, and how coordination happens, that tells you this is more than a personnel change. Second, how does the community react? Do developers, researchers, and major ecosystem players treat this as normal turnover? Or do they start asking harder questions about governance, direction, and accountability? In crypto, perception moves fast. A few calm statements can stabilize confidence, but a wave of confusion or criticism can do the opposite. Third, does this departure stay isolated or does it come with more exits? That's the real talent exodus question. One senior departure can happen anywhere, but if more people leave in a short period, then the market starts to wonder whether this is a one-off transition or the beginning of a wider pattern. And fourth, does the foundation's actions match its words? If it says the transition is healthy, but delays pile up, messaging stays vague, or key projects lose momentum, that mismatch matters. So the practical checklist is simple. Watch the leadership explanation, watch community sentiment, watch for follow-on departures, and watch execution. Because in Ethereum, the signal is rarely the announcement itself. It's what happens after the announcement that tells you whether this is routine change or a real shift in the network's future. Hsiao-Wei Wang, stepping down, has done more than shuffle a title inside the Ethereum Foundation. It has reopened a much bigger question. Who should steer Ethereum's next chapter? And what kind of leadership does a global blockchain actually need? That matters because in ecosystems like Ethereum, leadership is not just administration. It shapes confidence, culture, and the story investors, developers, and users tell themselves about the future. The honest reading is mixed. Yes, this kind of transition can create uncertainty, especially when people are already watching governance, scaling, and long-term directions so closely. But it can also be the start of something clearer, more intentional, and better aligned with what Ethereum needs right now. So the takeaway is simple. Leadership changes in major blockchain networks are never just internal housekeeping. They can influence how the entire community sees the next era. And that story, more than most people realize, can move markets, momentum, and belief.